You're listening to Sports Connections with David Smale, the show that brings you a fun and intimate look into connections throughout sports. Now here's your host, David Smale.
Mike Doc Emmerich is probably the best known hockey announcer in America. But did you know that he has also broadcast NFL games? He was on the mic when Brett Favre threw his first pass for the Green Bay Packers. Quick trivia question, what Hall of Famer caught that pass? We'll get back to that. But hockey is his bread and butter. A native of basketball-crazy Indiana, he's been a part of every major network's hockey coverage, broadcasting Stanley Cup playoffs, Olympics, and regular season NHL games. His nickname of Doc is well earned as he earned a PhD in communications from Bowling Green State University. His fluid, energetic call keeps the viewer informed on who has the puck and who is likely to get it next. Doc, welcome to Sports Connection.
Thank you, David. It's wonderful to be here.
Now, growing up in Indiana, how did you get your start in hockey?
Well, we had a hockey team called the Fort Wayne Comets that are still there to this day. They began in 1952. I began in the maternity ward of the Marion, Indiana General Hospital in 1946. So I was 6 when they came. I had no clue about hockey until I started seeing it on television. And 1960 was a very significant year for hockey because of a gold medal winning Olympic team at Squaw Valley. And those games were shown on CBS. Okay. And they were starting to show some NHL games. Well, I became intrigued by watching it on our snow-filled television at that time. And so badgered my parents to take my brother and me to a game in Fort Wayne. And it was in December of that year. And I'd wanted to be a baseball announcer until that time. But at age 14, I saw my first live game. And David, it was like an epiphany moment. I wanted to be a hockey announcer. You can imagine what my guidance counselor in high school in rural Indiana thought about that. But anyway, that was what I wanted to do. And so that was how I got the hockey bug that bit me.
What was it about that game? Because I think hockey in person is so much better than on TV, unless you're announcing the game. And I can follow when you're announcing the game. But in person, it's so much better. What was it about that game that bit you, basically?
The speed of it. And even though this was probably single A rather than double, triple, or the major leagues, they were a lot of phone calls away from the NHL, these guys. And most of them were never going to go. But you couldn't tell by how hard they played. And there was a fight with 2 seconds left in overtime. And I thought, gee, this is not all-star wrestling. These are real fights here. It was a slam bang game, and there was a lot of excitement to it. There was a goal scored in the last minute to tie it. And all of those facets together, it was just, there were 8,000 people there. There wasn't an empty seat in the place. Wow. And it was, you just got buoyed aloft by the crowd and by the speed and by the collisions and everything else. And so I was hooked. Simple as that.
My favorite place to watch a game in person is behind the goal, because, I grew up watching basketball as well, as you probably did. People don't realize that hockey has fast breaks, as fluid and as orchestrated as any sport. And when you're behind the goal, you see those. So I think that's an interesting place to watch it. Do you like watching behind the goal, or do you have a favorite spot?
Well, as a broadcaster, you want to do 50-yard line perception, because you want to see the sleeve numbers, and those numbers are about 4 inches. So, and a lot of times you're 150 feet away. So you need to pick those numbers up. But where you watch from, normally hockey scouts like to sit in the corner of the lower arena at the end, because they can see the plays develop that way, and they can see how players react, and they can evaluate individual players better than watching from the sideline view. You are perceptive in the fact that you can see a lot more from the end zone if you are a scientist about the sport than you can from the typical mid-rink sideline seat.
Okay, I want to ask you one more thing before we get into your career about your background. You grew up in Indiana. I bet you're a basketball fan as well, aren't you?
Yes, we followed basketball. Our team left for Detroit. The Zollner Pistons went to Detroit, but the hockey team was drawing 8,000 fans, and people could see basketball anywhere. And so the Pistons were okay, and they won a championship. there, but they weren't a novelty. Hockey was a novelty. So I am a basketball fan, and my bracket was awful. I went heavily on the Big Ten. I even thought Michigan State would beat UCLA in the play-in game. Well, I was wrong on that one too. I was so prejudiced toward Big Ten teams, and so a lot of my picks went away real early.
Yeah, that I think you were one of about 10 million people that were thinking the Big Ten would do really well. I'm in Kansas City, and so I'm Big 12 country, and I always, put my personal allegiances aside and choose all the Big 12, and that usually, like this year, didn't help out. Okay, let's talk about your career. Your career has really been kind of a travel log of small towns and major cities, working your way through the minor leagues of hockey before finally reaching the NHL with the Flyers in 1980-81. Just talk about that journey. What was it like working your way through those cities?
Well, I got a great opportunity in a number of places to get in free. And when I was buying tickets to see games, I was not made of money. I was a high school and a college kid. And at the time that you can least afford to is when you need to see games. But finally, when I got to Miami of Ohio, Miami University, we had a football coach there named Bo Schembechler, but all we had in hockey was a club team. And they played in a semi-outdoor arena in Covington, Kentucky called the Dixie Ice Bowl. But only an hour away from Oxford, Ohio was Dayton. That was where the Dayton Gems in the IHL played all their games. I got a pass. So I got in free, and my little Volkswagen Beetle was headed to Dayton every time the Gems played. And I got a chance to watch a lot of games and sit in the press box and learn through osmosis a lot about the sport. One of the people I talked to was the Dayton announcer named Lyle Stieg. He actually worked a year with the Washington Capitals doing games in the NHL. But he advised me, if I wanted to get into this, to try to come up with different ways of saying the same thing. He said there's so many repetitive actions in hockey that if you use the same words all the time, you'll drive people nuts. So try to come up with different ways of saying the same thing. That's the one bit of advice I remember from those years. And then it was just sending out tapes and hoping that somebody would give me a chance. And finally, in 1973, someone did. And it was this team right here, the Port Huron Flags in Port Huron, Michigan, right on the border with Canada. They were in the IHL, that same league that Fort Wayne was in. And that was 47 years ago. And I was making $160 a week. It was the most money I'd ever had in my life.
and just, I mean, I grew up in Kansas City, but I just really appreciate small town America. That had to be enjoyable for you, not only to be representing a small town, but to travel to these other small towns, because the IHL was made up of the Fort Waynes and all of these smaller cities. Did you enjoy being a part of small town America in your career?
Yeah, I did. And even when I graduated to the American Hockey League, I was in Portland, Maine. And we played in places like Rochester and New Haven and Binghamton, New York, but we also played in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And it was Christmas time, the first time we made a trip into Hershey. And I thought I had wound up in Disneyland because there's a park there, there's an arena. It's a town of 16,000 people. It's that small, but they have a professional hockey team there. It's very close to Harrisburg. And I liked it, and I told my wife, this is a place you've got to see. And eventually we went back there one spring to watch a playoff series after our own team had been knocked out. And eventually, while we were working for the Philadelphia Flyers, we lived in Hershey, 100 miles away, because we liked it so much. Both of us worked for the Flyers. We only worked game days. And so we would make that trip every game day morning, 100 miles in. And after the game was over that night, 100 miles back, but never minded because it was such a wonderful town.
And I've been all over. I've been in the 48 contiguous states, still waiting on Alaska and Hawaii. I can't think of a better smelling town than Hershey, Pennsylvania. That's right. I mean, Kansas City doesn't have it, but not too far west of here, you can smell the farms. And I'm not talking about the corn and the wheat. I'm talking about the hogs and the cows and things like that. You drive into Hershey, Pennsylvania, you get out of your car, it's like, I smell chocolate. It's everywhere. So that I'm sure that was one of the highlights as well.
Yes, it's like baking, but 9 out of every 10 days, the prevailing winds were from the chocolate factory, and so it would smell like someone is baking. The 10th day was from the dairy farms, and it was like what you just described. So it wasn't 100%, but it was almost.
Yeah, yeah. Now you've been on. I was looking at your history on Wikipedia, which knows everything, and you've been on ESPN, Fox, ABC, NBC, CBS. You've been on every, and as well as some of the smaller networks. How did you get on every major network broadcasting hockey?
Well, people were very kind to invite me to do hockey games. The rights change a lot. Process of changing, at least the major rights have gone to ESPN. NBC may still wind up with rights extension as well. But the rights did change a lot of times. And fortunately, there were people that wanted me to be a part of their broadcasting package. So whenever anyone reads off the list of places I've worked, it becomes obvious I couldn't hold a job.
Now, you've done 22, if I'm not mistaken, 22 Stanley Cup finals. Obviously, there's parts of each one that you remember, but do you have a favorite memory from any of those Stanley Cup finals?
I'll tell you one throwback sort of thing that Eddie Olczyk and I worked together for 14 years, but in 2008 and in 2009, the final sent Detroit against Pittsburgh. And when you've traveled a lot like he and I have on aircrafts, to get in a car and drive back and forth between the two cities in a Stanley Cup final for 2 years is pretty special, because then you don't have metal detectors to go through. And it's not that air travel was bad. It's just that it was a respite from all of the aircrafts and all of the terminals and all of that. And you just rented a car and drove back and forth between the two cities, because it was about 4 hours or so from Detroit to Pittsburgh. And the competition was good. Detroit won in 6 games in Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh won in 7 games in Detroit. And so both teams won one of them, and both teams were loaded with stars. So I think that's why that one stands out. Yeah,
Sidney Crosby and Steve Yzerman still part of that Detroit team, and guys like that. Is that right?
Yeah, Steve was actually watching both of those years from the press box as a member of the hierarchy. He had retired just shortly before that. But they were loaded with Pavel Datsyuk and Henrik Zetterberg and Nick Lidstrom, who was probably one of the greatest defensemen I ever saw play.
Yeah.
And Pittsburgh, of course, had Crosby and Malkin and guys that they still have to this day playing for them. So they were thrilling series, and they were heavily combative, and all the things that you look forward to in a championship.
Yeah, I went to a fight the other night and a hockey game broke out. There is something about a good hockey fight that civilized people can still enjoy.
Yeah, we don't have as many as we once did.
Right.
But it's still spontaneous fighting is still tolerated by the NHL. And I am glad that it is, because it may eventually be ruled out. But it is a way that things equalize and steam gets let off sometimes when it needs to be. And even though the number of games in which there is a fight has dwindled to about 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 now, there are times when there is a need to pay back someone on the other team for them doing a dirty thing to one of your star players. And so that's one of the reasons that a fight may take place. That was the reason that they happened years ago as well. Yeah. So that part of the sport is not different.
Yeah. You've also done 6 Olympic hockey tournaments. That's got, I see over your shoulder, you've got a USA jersey there as well. How cool was that to broadcast Olympic hockey?
You go there and you don't sleep. And you know, going in, you're not going to sleep, not out of nervousness, but out of excitement, because you are privileged to see the best players from Sweden play the best players from the Czech Republic. And then they leave the ice. And then on come the best players from Canada and the best players from Finland. And then they leave the ice. And then the best from Russia and the best from the United States are playing. And you realize how privileged you are and how much responsibility you have to convey this. And with every network that I did Olympics, there was a mandate, and particularly with NBC, to not be cheering for the home country. They said that this is a hockey competition, and so you treat it. Yes, of course, you're an American. Yes, of course, you're doing this from an American perspective. You're probably going to talk more about the U.S. players than the players from Slovakia, but there's going to be no cheerleading here. And that, I think, gave people I hope it gave them a more favorable opinion of what our teams were doing at various times for various networks when we were over there, in trying to convey what we really thought was going on rather than what we wanted them to think was going on.
You talk about the players from Finland and the players from Sweden and Czech Republic and Russia. And I think one of the most difficult things broadcasting hockey has to be all the different names. And you just rattled off a few of them with Detroit and Pittsburgh. Those names just roll off your tongue. Is that something that comes naturally to you? Do you really have to work to be able to just rattle them off like they're your next door neighbor or somebody you grew up with?
Well, if you go to a movie and you see it and you like it, you come back and you see it a second time, you know all the characters. And that's similar to what we have in hockey. The difference is that the second time the movie changes plot, but it's still the same characters. And when they change teams, oftentimes they take the same number, especially the star players, the high numbered players. The harder part, I think the more challenging part is, as I was saying before, you only have a 4-inch sleeve number to identify players with. They aren't turning their backs to you. Yeah. If they're showing their backs to you where you're located from, they're going to be in the minors the next day. They're going left to right across your vision path and right to left. So you have to be able to pick up those numbers. And sometimes, depending on the uniform design, that is the main challenge that you have. The names are just names. If you were to think of 50 people that you know, you might have some names that are short, like King and Barnes, and you might have some names that are polysyllabic, that are 4 or 5 syllables, and yet you know them all. Why? Because you've used them before. And once you use a name once, you can use it 50 times, and it's not really much of a thought process anymore. It's more of picking up the number and transferring it to a name quickly. That's the challenge, because you have to be able to see the number.
Yeah, and that leads to my second point about the difficulty of broadcasting hockey as opposed to any other sport. With basketball, you're up close, the numbers are bigger. The guys are wearing tank tops or the gals are wearing, short sleeve T-shirts or whatever. In hockey, the numbers aren't big, and that is the fastest moving sport. I'm always amazed with how well you say, from Datsuk to, and it sounds I can't even come up with the names to pretend as quickly as you do. And it's just seamless. That and I'm not just blowing smoke here, Doc. I mean, I am really impressed with how smooth your delivery is with such a fast-paced game.
Oh, it's kind of you to say, David. I'll tell you, part of it is just the raw number of games. And whenever anyone, young people send me their work all the time, and I evaluate it and give them an opinion for nothing, because I had people that did that for me.
Sure.
And a lot of times I'll tell them, look, I know that you feel like you're not doing this that well. You are. But give yourself another 100 games. Yeah. You just need reps. Yeah. And reps can solve an awful lot of problems. And just through that, you learn how to fill in space that might otherwise need to be filled. Now, of the 4 major sports, I think hockey is the easiest one to do from the standpoint of we're always calling continuous action. And if the play stops, we're either going to commercial, or the person that's sitting next to you, that's his time to talk. But whenever it's in my court, it's just describing what I see. We don't have to wait for players to unpile like in football. We don't have to wait for all the timeouts as in basketball. And we don't have to wait between pitches like baseball. We're either going or we're stopping, and it belongs in somebody else's court, or we're in commercial, one or the other. So it's the easier one of the 4, I think.
All right. I'll let you keep that opinion. I think it would be next to impossible. Okay. I want to interrupt our regularly scheduled interview to see if you remember the answer to the trivia question. Which Hall of Famer caught Brett Favre's first pass as a member of the Packers?
I think Matt Millen described that it was almost Ray Lewis of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but he got it in a piece of it, and it went back into Brett Favre's arms, and he was tackled for a short loss. So it was a completion.
Right.
He had actually, I believe, thrown 4 passes for the Atlanta Falcons the previous year or during his time there, but he'd not had, to my knowledge, I don't think he'd completed any. But that was his first Packer pass, and it was to himself.
Yep.
And it was a completion, so he was 1 for 1. Although I think it was a net loss of a couple of yards.
Yep. And actually, with Atlanta, he completed 2 passes, but they count.
Did he?
They don't count. He was 0 for 4, but he had 2 incompletions. Or 2 interceptions. So he did complete 2 passes, but not the way he wanted to. So, okay.
Very good.
Back to hockey. One of the things that's kind of cool, especially for our younger listeners, is you also provided the voiceover for EA Sports hockey games. How much fun was that?
That was a lot of fun, and it was a challenge too, because I would imagine that somebody who's playing the game has the perception of Doc and Eddie Olczyk go into a studio and they watch video of games and they just describe what they see. That's not it, because the person who is playing the game controls how the game is going, who's on the ice. And so a typical day for me would be, and Eddie and I would be together for maybe 4 hours in a week's time, but we would be separate most of the time. So I would go in a studio and I would have nothing in front of me but a computer screen, no active players or anything. And the computer screen would have something on it that would say, end of game, goalie pulled, they can't get him off the ice, still in their own end. And so without using team names, without using player names, what you had to do was to describe in your mind a confusing set of circumstances where a team was trying to get its goaltender off, was still back in its own end. They couldn't get out. They couldn't get the goaltender out. And that was just one possible scenario that could occur in the game. And then once the producers felt that that was a satisfactory description, they would say, okay, we need 4 more, because they wanted variety of that play. So the mental fatigue at the end of the day was significant. It was kind of like being one time in my life in college, I was in one of the plays and I had about 250 speeches in the play. And it was never more exhausted than I was in the evening after all our rehearsals, because it was mentally exhausting. And it was a comparable thing with that. Was it unpleasant? No, because you worked with people that you enjoyed being around. But it was a challenge to imagine as much as you had to imagine. And then the last day was the day that you went through what they called the phone book. And that was all of the new players that had come into professional or international hockey in that year. And you talk about pronunciations. Yeah. And you would scream their names as having scored a goal. Now we had, if you'll consider volumes, we had 3, 5, 7, and 9. 3 was like a normal circle to circle pass in your own end. And it would be like Duncan Keith. And 5 would be like he's advancing the puck to center ice. And you would say, Duncan Keith. And then 7 was maybe he's taking a shot. Keith. And then when he'd score, then you'd yell, Keith. But then on the last day, you would do all of those couple hundred names at 9. You'd save it to the last day and the last hour of your work, because by the time that was over, you wouldn't have much of your voice left. Yeah, and you didn't have to work the next day anyway. And it was a good thing. So they saved all those to the end. So that's your answer to what it was like to do a video game. And it was great fun. So you didn't have to say what he did. You would just say Duncan Keith, and then they would plug in passes to or whatever. Yeah. Okay. Exactly. You had done those phrases about passing and shooting and all of that earlier. But those would be what they would say stitched in, depending on who the game player had on the ice at the time and how they were playing the game and where they had him in position and whether they decided he would shoot or not. Okay. So all of those things that are just beyond my imagination, but not beyond EA Sports, they came up with. And So I was just there to not read a script, but to basically imagine what was going on.
That's pretty cool. You mentioned Eddie Olczyk, and I think I pronounced his name correctly.
Yes.
Just talk about some of the people that you partnered with in almost 50 years.
Most recently, Brian Boucher, who's a former goaltender, who is hilarious because he can do the voices of other goaltenders, some of whom he played against. And a couple of them don't like the fact that he can imitate them. But he's a wonderful guy to work with in that he speaks slowly and he is between the benches. And when he talks, he brings you in because all of a sudden, he's not talking a lot of the time, but he's saying something. And when he does, you know that it's going to be significant. Pierre Maguire was his predecessor and still does an awful lot. He is a world traveler, has been about every city that a hockey tournament at any level has been played. The subject of Ufa in Russia will come up, and he will have been there because he will have been there to cover the World Junior Championships. If you name a place in Finland or in Sweden, he will have been there. So he's a walking encyclopedia of what these places are like, and having seen so many of these players at different levels in their careers, he can speak to that. Eddie Olczyk, of course, because we are side by side up in the booth, and we traveled together a lot of those years. We've gotten to know one another much better because we're spending more time together. And he's just a great soul who has won a battle with colon cancer, having gone through all 12 chemotherapy treatments and continued to work in the off week between each of the 2-week treatments.
Wow.
Just a magnificent person and one of my best friends. Back through the years, John Davidson was a magnet in attracting information and getting it on the air. Bill Clement was one of the funniest people that I'd ever been around, and also was a scientist about broadcasting games. We used to have a training camp at his house in the fall where we would practice interviewing and just to get ready for the season, just like players would get ready. Peter McNabb, I still talk with occasionally. He's the announcer for the Colorado Avalanche. He left New Jersey, where he and I had worked together in 1995. And since that time, he's been with the Colorado Avalanche. And maybe he'll get a chance to see a championship sometime in the near future. Who knows? All right, those are some of many people. Chico Resch in New Jersey. And I don't want to leave any out, but I'm going to because we only have so much time.
Yeah. As a longtime Islanders fan, I'm glad you brought up Chico. But great Islanders keeper. I want to talk about one of the coolest traditions in all of sports and get your perspective on that. And that is after a series is done in the playoffs, and it could be the bloodiest, nastiest, most vicious series. The two teams line up on opposite ends of the ice and come together and they shake hands. And I don't know how much of that is forced, but it looks like they're really paying respect to the other guy that they just beat the snot out of 10 minutes earlier. Just talk about that tradition, where it came from, and how cool that is. It is nowhere else in sports.
I think the first recording of a handshake line occurred probably in the early part of the 20th century. I saw one note that said it was 1904, long before the NHL was formed. But there are others that searched it out last spring near playoff time, trying to determine, last summer, I guess it would have been, trying to determine when it began. But when it began is immaterial. It's that it continues to go on despite the fact that the sport itself, in terms of its speed and its internationality, has changed. The tradition has been maintained all this time. And you will find situations where one player has put another out of the lineup early in the series, but then he is back in before the series is over. And yet they will meet in the handshake line and they'll pound each other on the shoulder pads and say, good job, good luck in the next series, or have a good summer. See you next year. It's hard to describe how it's continued all this time, and that, as you described, they are the fiercest of enemies, and then it all evaporates in about 45 seconds after the final horn, and they line up and they shake hands, and there occasionally are smiles, there occasionally are hugs, and they move on. One goes to shower and the other showers and gets ready for another series. It's just remarkable to see. And I'm so glad we're still having it.
And that's not just NHL. That I've seen that at lower level professional. I see it in college. Obviously it's in the Olympics. That I think that's just the coolest tradition in all of sports. Do you agree?
Yes, I think so. Others who are more into other sports will probably find traditions that are really good there. I see on the gridiron a lot of times after games are over, I'll see professionals stand around, despite the fact that the crowd is milling around. I'll see individuals actually stand and talk to each other. But I think this is such an organized thing, but not mandated. Once in a while, a player will be so upset he will escape and not take part, but 99.5% of them do. And it's a wonderful tradition, and it always makes you feel good to watch it happen.
Yeah, for sure. Now you've had a lot of personal highlights. We talk about the fact you've been broadcasting hockey for close to 50 years. It's interesting. I found this in looking on Wikipedia. You're the only hockey broadcaster to win an Emmy Award for excellence in sports broadcasting, and you've won 9 of them. You're the first member of the media elected to the U.S. Hockey Hall of Fame. Which of your awards, and maybe it's neither of those, but which of the things that you have received, the honors, stands out the most for you?
Well, I think being married 42 years is a real achievement. And given what a woman has to tolerate for someone who has a life in sports. And I met my wife the first year that I was hanging around this team, and we dated for 4 years, and she was going to remain here, and her life was going to be here. And I knew that mine was going to have to leave here to move on with my ambitions. And after about 6 months apart, we realized neither of us were doing that well apart from one another. So we got married on one summer in 1978. And I think when we celebrated our 40th anniversary, I figured up and told Joyce, you realize you've been alone probably 5,000 nights since we've been married because of my commitment to hockey. So she realized that I loved a sport and that I also loved her. And her giving that back to me has always been a great achievement for me and a very lucky part of my life. So I think beyond the material awards, that's probably the greatest one of all, that we still like one another, love one another. And now with the pandemic, we've been together for 13 months solid, no air travel. And boy, do I not miss it. I am so happy to be home and to be spending more time with her and with the various creatures that we have nearby.
I'll tell you what, I've asked that question to every person I've done a podcast with so far. That is absolutely the best answer that I've ever gotten. So because it shows your priorities, and that's great. So I usually finish with this question, but I'm gonna transition, and then we'll finish up with one other one. Just talk about your family. Do you have any kids, grandkids?
Our kids are canine. In the early years, we elected not to have children because I was traveling so much, and if I was going to be a father, I wanted to be around. So we elected not to. And for a while, we really didn't feel it was fair to have a pet because of the different schedules we had. She worked in the box office for the Flyers for 10 years. And part of that time, I was broadcasting Rangers or Devils. Schedules never seemed to mesh. Later on, after she retired from working, we based ourselves where we have been back here in Michigan, and we got a small dog. And then along came another small dog, and along came horses. And so there are plenty of God's creatures around us, and they make our life a lot better. So we didn't have children. We spoil our nephew crazily. I have a brother and a stepmom who live in Indiana. She's 96, and he's a Dodger fan. I'm a Pirate fan, which means he's destined to win championships, and I am not.
Well, there's still hope for small market. As I told you, I'm in Kansas City, and
yes, that's what they point to.
Two World Series and one championship recently. So there is hope. And I'll tell you what, standing in the dugout prior to Game 7 of the 2014 World Series, I looked at some members of the media. We'd been around since the mid 80s when the Royals won it. And I asked several of them the same question. Do you believe we're about to watch the Royals in Game 7 of the World Series? And none of us thought it would ever happen. And then it happened the next year, and we actually won it. So there is hope for the small markets. I always root for a small market when they're going up against the big dogs in baseball, for sure. So last question I like to ask everybody, give you a chance. And I know you've got to run. I appreciate your time, Doc. What's your legacy?
I leave that up to other people to determine. I'm not very good at trying to decide what I am or who I am. I just count myself as very lucky to have been able to survive cancer, to have been loved by someone like I have for this long a period of time, to have met so many people in sports, and more so to have been helped by so many people. You mentioned earlier the number of networks that I had worked for. Somebody had to help me along the way to get those jobs, and maybe it was somebody that worked for the networks that did that. So there are a lot of people that I have tried to write snail mail thank yous to over the last 5 years. Snail mail, I think, is very special because not only does the writer have to dwell on his words, because it's not fast. And I, in particular, print because my handwriting is not very good. So I print.
Well, you are a doctor.
Time.
You are a doctor. So there's your excuse.
Right. So you print those things out, and then they're a surprise because people don't get snail mail, personal mail much anymore. And one of the heartening things that happens is you get so much back from doing that. And I heard back in a letter that I sent to someone who's actually quite famous, and of all things, he said, I was looking back on my own career, and I wondered if there was ever a difference I made in anybody's life. And then your letter arrived. And I thought, of all people, this famous person was unsure if he had ever made a difference in people's lives. And I guess it just needed to be reinforced in writing. So anyway, I'm not sure that answers your question, but legacy, I have no grasp on.
Well, that answered it perfectly. And Doc, I appreciate your time. It's good I've followed your career. I've enjoyed watching it, as I say, and I'm not blowing smoke. You make watching hockey. Now, I watch it in the playoffs. It's totally different than the regular season, but you make it more enjoyable because I actually understand who. Okay, what's that guy's number? Okay, what's he doing? You're so fluid. I really enjoy that, and it's been a pleasure to chat with you today. Thank you very much.
It has been for me too, and you guys have a World Series recently. My boys haven't won one since 1979, so let's go Bucks.
We are We are family, right?
We are family. That's right. Yeah, that's right.
All right. Thanks, Doc. Good talking to you.
Thanks for listening to Sports Connections with David Smale. Make sure to subscribe, follow, and rate the show from your favorite podcast platform. You can learn more about David Smale and his work by visiting davidsmalebooks.com. Don't forget to join us weekly for new episodes. Until next time.